Being a cop in a small town in Minnesota probably isn't the most exciting career there is, but it's not bad either. It's actually a relatively peaceful and safe line of work, compared to being in law enforcement in one of the big cities, New York or LA for instance, where the action is at. There's only around 10,000 people in the town where I live. It's way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of open farmland. And the only real crime that ever occurs is pretty minor stuff. The occasional rowdy rednecks getting into a fist fight at one of the 3 bars downtown, teenage vandals, petty theft, the odd drunk driver, a case of disorderly conduct here and there, the rare breaking and entering, that sort of thing. The only real serious stuff that I've ever had to deal with is a couple of cases of domestic violence and assault and battery. But even that was pretty typical, I guess, and it doesn't happen very often. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one case that still haunts me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I was saying, I live in a pretty peaceful little town. Boring, some would even say. The kind of rural, out-of-the-way hick farming community you've probably driven through on the highway yourself on the way to someplace more interesting, without as much as a second thought or a glance back. The kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happens, you probably thought, and for the most part, you'd be right. But there is one case that I can't get out of my mind. One case that still makes my blood run cold whenever I think about it. One case I can't explain no matter how much I try to rationalize it to myself. What happened to the old Garrity woman 7 years ago? I had been a police officer for 5 years when it happened in the early spring of 14. There were only 5 cops on the entire town police force. Me, my partner Jerry, Pete and Vance who both worked the night shift, and the police chief. Plus there was Karen, an older woman who was a retired librarian and worked part-time as the dispatcher. The police department was located in the town municipal building and consisted of 2 offices. One for the chief and one for the rest of us to share, and 3 jail cells in the rear, and the 3 of them were never all occupied at the same time. It was an overcast, rainy afternoon in late March or early April. Me and Jerry were in our cruiser on a routine patrol around town when Karen's voice came over the radio telling us where there was a possible 1082 in progress at the Garrity house on Turner Road. For those of you who aren't in the know, a 1082 is police code for a burglary. We acknowledged and then changed directions heading for the Garrity home. I wasn't unduly concerned about the call. I already had a pretty good idea about who made it. Eileen Garrity was an elderly widow who lived in a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She was probably around 65 or 70 years old and had lived alone since her husband had died of a stroke 3 years before. They had 2 adult children, but they both lived out of town and they never visited. Since her husband's death, she had developed something of a reputation for being eccentric, to put it nicely, or crazy to put it not so nicely. She was a shut-in who rarely left her home and had her groceries delivered once a week. Basically, a crazy cat lady minus the cats. The reason she was considered crazy was because she had become pretty flaky and paranoid since being widowed, and had called the police department on multiple occasions for everything, from hearing intruders moving around in her attic to seeing UFOs in her cornfield. There were probably at least a dozen others too. All her calls turned out to be false alarms, of course. The burglars she claimed were hiding in her attic turned out to be a pair of raccoons that had slipped in under the roof, and the UFOs were probably just jets flying overhead from the National Guard base 50 miles west. Me and Jerry and Pete and Vance had all visited her home before during our respective shifts. We never got frustrated with her or gave her a hard time about it and usually indulged her, inspecting her house and property to calm her nerves. She would relax, thank us, and we would leave, and the process would repeat itself in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. Honestly, our infrequent trips to her house were probably the only real highlight of what was a rather dull and unexciting job. When we had told the chief about Mrs. Garrity's latest emergency, Bigfoot was sneaking around her yard, or there was a giant anaconda lurking in the basement, he would just shake his head sadly. When Vance and Pete were the ones who had to deal with her, they would tell us all about her most recent ordeal when me and Jerry saw them at the end of their shifts and the start of ours. They would usually smirk in a mean-spirited way, and Pete would twirl his finger next to his temple before they left. Jerry and I felt sorry for the old woman. It couldn't have been easy for her, a frail, nervous, lonely woman living all alone in that old crumbling house with no friends or close family. I suspected she might be getting senile or maybe entering the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. We worried about her living there by herself, almost a mile from the nearest neighbor. If her health had suddenly turned bad or she had an accident and couldn't call for help, well, there wasn't really much that we could do about it. A couple times I looked up the numbers of her daughter and son and tried calling them about possibly placing her in an assisted living home or a mental health facility. But the one time that I managed to reach her son, as I was explaining his mother's situation to him, he interrupted me telling me that he was too busy at the moment and that he would call me back, and then he abruptly ended the call. He never did call me back, and from then on they always happened to be unavailable and never answered any of the voicemail messages that I left them. So Jerry and me turned on Turner Road and drove up to Mrs. Garrity's house on the gray, rainy late spring day, certain that the old woman was just overreacting yet again to something relatively minor and her imagination was playing tricks on her. She was waiting for us outside on her porch when we pulled to a stop. I'll never forget how she looked. It shocked me. She had already been a thin and frail woman the other times that we had been out there, but we hadn't seen her in probably a couple of months, since her last false emergency, and she had changed drastically since then. Now she was gaunt, almost emaciated, her cheeks hollow and dark rings around her bloodshot and sunken eyes. Her gray hair was tangled and didn't look like it had been washed in days or maybe weeks, and the dress that she was wearing was wrinkled and dirty. Her physical appearance was alarming enough, but there was also something about the way that she was staring at both of us with those dark, dull eyes that seemed to look at us, through us, and past us all at once. It reminded me of old photos that I had seen of American soldiers in war. The blank, expressionless, shell-shocked look of somebody who had been through more horror than any ordinary person should have to endure. Me and Jerry exchanged a shocked look and then got out and approached the old woman. "What seems to be the trouble, Mrs. Garrity?" Jerry asked her, trying to keep his voice nonchalant. "There's something in my house," she told us in a flat, toneless voice. She was shaking slightly, a woman on the verge of total physical and mental exhaustion. The way she phrased it, not someone but something, made me raise my eyebrow. "Well, you just wait here and we'll go have a look and make sure that it's safe," I told her, trying not to sound too patronizing. I looked to Jerry and nodded. We drew our pistols and stepped past Mrs. Garrity, cautiously entering the house. We did a routine sweep of the first floor, guns leveled, and then headed upstairs. It only took about 5 minutes to check out the house. We had done it so many times before that we had the layout down pat, and there was no sign of any intruders or evidence of a breaking and entering, but I saw plenty of other things that disturbed me deeply. For one thing, the place was a total mess. The house was already pretty decrepit, but Mrs. Garrity had still taken pride at how clean she kept it, and it had always been spick and span on our earlier visits. But now dirty dishes were stacked high in the kitchen sink. The counters were dirty and trash and dirty laundry littered the floors. I also noticed that Mrs. Garrity's pillow and blankets were lying rumpled on the couch in the living room. The surface of the coffee table in front of it was cluttered with half-drunk cups of coffee, open containers of food, a Bible, and a rosary. It looked like she had been eating and sleeping in the living room for some time now. When we went upstairs, sure enough, the bed in Mrs. Garrity's room was bare. and the room itself looked like it had been vacant for quite a while. There was also something in the living room that really alarmed me. Leaning in one corner was an old double-barreled shotgun that had probably belonged to her late husband. Jerry picked it up, broke it open, and found 2 spent shells in the chamber. He took one out, sniffed it, and then told me the gun had been fired very recently. We also discovered something else bizarre. All the mirrors in Mrs. Garrity's house had been shattered, and every closet door had been boarded shut. The one in the front hall on the first floor had a huge hole blasted in the center of it, smaller holes pitting the splintered wood around it. You didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to deduce that Mrs. Garrity had fired her husband's shotgun into that door. But why? What the heck had happened here? Jerry shot me a perplexed and questioning look. I shrugged, clueless and equally bewildered. Finished with our inspection of the house, we put away our pistols and turned around to go back outside. Mrs. Garrity was standing in the room behind us, staring at us with that unnerving blank expression. Both of us almost jumped a foot in the air and startled. Neither of us had heard her enter. Jerry regained his composure and flashed her a fake, reassuring smile. "We don't see any sign of him, Mrs. Garrity. He must have slipped out the back. You're safe now." She didn't relax or appear relieved like she had the countless other times that we had humored her. Her face seemed to twitch and some new look dawned in her eyes. It took me a moment to identify it. It was a look of pure, hopeless doom mixed with utter terror. "No," she said in that same odd, listless, flat voice. "I'm not safe. It's still here, it's hiding. That's why you couldn't find it, and after you leave it'll come back for me." And then she began to quiver. She started to cry with total despair, breaking down into hysterical sobs that racked her whole body. Jerry and me looked at each other concerned. We went to the old woman and comforted her as best as we could, guiding her over to her couch and sitting her down with us on either side of her, coaxing her gently back to a state of calm. After she had herself back under control, we asked her to explain what had happened. She was quiet for a few moments, gathering her thoughts, and then she began to speak. As we listened to her story, my body temperature seemed to gradually drop and I felt a chill envelop me. Several times I made eye contact with Jerry and his expression was a mirror of my own, disbelief and fear. "It started about a month ago," she began. "That's when I first heard the scratching at my closet door." A soft, slow, steady scratching that seemed to come from inside her bedroom closet at night. At first, she had assumed it was probably a mouse or some other small animal, except the scratching seemed to come from too high up to be the work of a mouse. Whenever she opened the closet door, always after the scratching had stopped, there had been nothing there. Several times she had started to open the closet door when the scratching was in progress to get to the bottom of it once and for all. But each time she had grabbed the knob, she had been overwhelmed with a sudden, overwhelming, irrational sense of unease and had been unable to do it. The scratching sounded too deliberate, too gentle, too deceptive, too harmless, as if something was trying to lure her into opening the closet door. To be safe, she had started locking her closet door at night. Over the next several days, the scratching had gotten louder and more intense, as if something was trying to tunnel its way through the wood. One day, she opened her closet door and found claw marks on the other side, claw marks that were 6 feet off the ground, claw marks that looked like they had been made by fingernails. The horror had really started for Mrs. Garrity about a week after she had first heard the scratching sounds. One night, she had awoken to a voice softly calling for her, a voice that seemed to be coming from the locked closet door. She was bewildered, even more so because she had recognized that voice. It belonged to Bill, her dead husband. Bill's voice had pleaded for her to open the closet door, telling her that God had sent him down to take her up to heaven where they could be together again, and young like they had used to be forever. At this point, Jerry had looked at me wide-eyed from the other side of the couch. Then what happened? I prodded her gently. I thought that I was dreaming, Mrs. Garrity said. I thought it had to be a dream. Poor Bill had been gone for 3 years, and since I was having a dream, I didn't see no harm in doing what he was asking me to. I got out of bed and went to the closet. I reached for the lock, but then I stopped. Something didn't seem right. It was Bill's voice and it seemed perfectly normal, but somehow it was wrong too. The way that he was talking, it wasn't like how Bill used to talk. It was like a stranger was using Bill's voice, trying to trick me into opening that closet door. That doesn't make much sense, does it? Actually, nothing she was telling us made sense, but we just asked her to continue telling her story. Bill, or whoever or whatever was using his voice, had continued to beg her to unlock the closet. When she had refused, the voice had changed, becoming harsh and belligerent. It had angrily demanded she open the door, and when she had still refused, it had begun to shout at her, using profanity and making obscene threats, things Bill never would have said to me while he was alive, before beginning to pound violently on the door. The voice had begun to change, and no longer sounding like her late husband's. It had become deeper and distorted until it didn't sound human. In terror, she had fled her bedroom and spent the night on the couch downstairs. Eventually, the pounding and the threats had stopped. Mrs. Garrity, Jerry politely interrupted her at this point. Why didn't you call us at the police station when this happened? She was silent for a moment, and then a small bitter smile formed on her lips. I thought you would think I was just imagining it, she told us. I know people in town think I'm a crazy old lady, and I've had you all out here so many times before for things that turned out to be nothing. I thought maybe it was all in my head and I didn't want to bother you about it. The things had escalated pretty quickly from there. The pounding and the threats had continued every night. She had been too scared to sleep in her bedroom and had started sleeping on the living room couch. And then one night the pounding had begun, not just on her bedroom closet door, but all of the closet doors in the house, all at the same time. Like there were people in all of them trying to get out all at once, she told us. But it was the same voice in every closet, the same horrible voice. In fear, she had nailed all the closet doors shut to keep the thing, whatever it was, from coming out to get her. And then about 2 weeks ago, something even more terrifying had happened. She had been in her bathroom and was washing her hands in the sink when she had looked up into the medicine cabinet mirror. Here, she paused. What did you see? Jerry asked her. I saw it, she said in a choked whimper. I saw its face instead of my own. It was wearing a black robe with a hood and its face. It was just a grinning skull. A skull with horns, and its eyes were red. The eyes of the devil himself. I don't mean that I saw it standing behind me in the mirror. It was in the mirror itself. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It reached out to the mirror. It didn't have hands, it had claws, and it tried to grab me. In horror, she had thrown a bottle of lotion at the mirror, shattering the glass, and then to be safe had done the same to all the other mirrors in the house. How could you stay in this house with all of that happening to you? I asked her. She shrugged sadly. I don't have anywhere else to go and nobody who'll take me in. The nights were awful, but it was always better during the days. At least then I could get some sleep. It always stopped by morning and never happened during the day. She suddenly shuddered. Well, until 3 days ago. Then it started happening all the time. Day and night, I wasn't safe no matter what time it was. It had all come to a head late this morning. The pounding had gradually gotten more violent and forceful until all the closet doors were rattling in their frames. Mrs. Garrity knew that even with the boards nailed over them, it was only a matter of time until that thing broke through. In desperation, she had begun praying and reading from the Bible, which had only caused the entity in the closet to laugh at her. Finally, she had gotten out Bill's shotgun and fired it through the closet door. For a minute or so, there wasn't a sound, she told us. I started to think that it was finally over. And then I saw those red eyes burning in the dark, in the hole that the shotgun had made. It chuckled and it said one word to me. What word did it say? I asked her. Tonight, she said, and began to tremble. She lowered her head into her hands and began to sob again. Jerry and I were silent for some time, trying to absorb what she had just told us. We looked at each other, deeply troubled by her story. Neither of us had actually believed it, of course, but it was obvious the poor woman was deeply disturbed. She was having some kind of nervous breakdown. Maybe her frayed grip on reality had finally snapped her, and maybe it was old age had taken its toll on her mind. But one thing was clear. It wasn't safe for her to be alone anymore, especially not here. It was not healthy for her. Heck, for all we knew, maybe her paranoid delusions were the result of some dangerous form of mold that had formed in her house. Jerry and I excused ourselves for a moment and then stepped outside to talk in private. We both agreed that she needed help and she needed to be institutionalized, but for now it was best that she stay somewhere else. We went back in and told Mrs. Garrity that she was coming with us. She was going to spend the night in a motel room in town, and tomorrow, Jerry added, we were going to find a priest who would come and exorcise the evil spirit that had been bothering her, getting rid of it once and for all. She broke down again, this time crying in relief, and hugged me and my partner, thanking us over and over again. We drove her to a cheap motel in town and checked her in. Her mental state already seemed to have improved in that short amount of time being away from that house. She smiled and told us that she couldn't wait to finally get a night of decent sleep, without having to worry about that thing banging on the doors. I think mostly she was just glad she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore of the entity she was convinced was lurking in her house. We both smiled at her and said goodbye, getting in the cruiser and driving away. Our smiles faded as soon as we had pulled away from the motel. We both drove in grim silence. We both liked old Mrs. Garrity in spite of all the times that she had made herself a nuisance to the police department with her bogus calls and her erratic behavior. We were sorry that her mental state had deteriorated to such a point that she could no longer look after herself. We told the chief her story when we got back. He sighed sadly and nodded, agreeing that she had to be committed somewhere. Tomorrow, him and me were going to drive out and personally visit her son and daughter and explain to them what was going on. And if they still refused to do what needed to be done, the chief would see it to himself that Mrs. Garrity got the help that she needed. But we never got the chance. The last time we ever saw Mrs. Garrity was when Jerry and I left her at the motel. Around 4 a.m. the next morning, I was awoken by an urgent phone call from Chief, telling me to get over to the motel as soon as possible. He wouldn't say why over the phone, but I already had a hunch it had something to do with Mrs. Garrity. I felt an awful sense of dread as I got dressed. I wondered if maybe she had taken her own life in her motel room after we had left her. When I arrived outside the motel, my fears were confirmed when I saw a crime scene tape blocking the door to Mrs. Garrity's room. The chief, along with Jerry and Pete and Vance, were gathered outside, along with a couple of cops from the state police and a pair of detectives from the city. The chief greeted me with a grave expression as I approached. He told me that Mrs. Garrity was gone. At first, I thought that he meant that she was dead, But then, seeing the solemn look on my face, he clarified himself. She was literally gone. I looked at him confused. I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, something that caused a ripple of fear in my heart. The chief was scared. He told me that he didn't know what to make of it himself. People in the neighboring rooms had heard blood-curdling screams and sounds of violence coming from Mrs. Garrity's room around 2 a.m., and then nothing. They had called the police department. Pete and Vance had been the first to arrive. They had pounded on the door, but there had been no response. Then they had forced the door open, and when they saw what was inside, they had called the chief himself. "Well, what did they find?" I asked him. "Well, maybe you ought to come see for yourself," he told me, leading to the doorway and under the crime scene tape. He explained to me that they had found no sign of forced entry, and that the door and windows of the motel room had all still been locked from the inside when Pete and Vance showed up. I took a look around, feeling a shiver run through my body. There was fresh blood splattered around the room, on the walls, the floor, bed, and even the ceiling. The blood-stained bedsheets had been ripped away from the mattress, as if someone had desperately tried holding on to them as they were pulled out of bed. There were 10 very thin trails of blood on the carpet leading away from the bed. 10 thin trails of blood that had been made by 10 desperate and terrified fingers, clawing for purchase as their owner was dragged away. I followed the bloody finger marks across the floor and away from the bed to where they ended, at the closet. I looked at them and then I looked at the chief. He looked back at me, his face hard and impassive, but fear gleaming in his eyes. I approached the closet. The door was standing open. I stood there looking in for some time. The closet was empty, completely empty. There wasn't even blood on the floor. They never found Mrs. Garrity. Hey everybody, it's me, the small-town Minnesota cop. I told you in my last post that the Garrity case was the scariest thing that had ever happened to me, and that apart from that, nothing much out of the ordinary has ever happened to me in the course of a mostly uneventful and rather dull career enforcing the law in a rural, middle-of-nowhere hick town most of you have probably never even heard of. Well, until about a week ago that was mostly true. Mostly. But in light of recent circumstances, I feel that I have a new story that I have to share with you. But first, I have to back up a bit and tell you about something that happened about 3 years ago. It was a strange thing, but at the time that I wrote the first story, it hardly seemed important enough to warrant mentioning. Cops get used to dealing with all kinds of weirdos, people reporting or confessing to false crimes and things of that sort. Usually it's a pissed-off wife trying to get her husband in trouble with a bogus domestic abuse claim, and that the rest are cranks seeking attention. People confessing to murders that they didn't commit, etc. I'm sure police departments in the big cities have to put up with crap like that all the time, but even small-town departments get it once in a while. It was, I believe, late June or early July in 2019. I was on the night patrol at the time. I usually work the day, but I was filling in for Vance because he was out to get his appendix removed. Joe, a rookie that we took on just the year before, was doing the day patrol with my partner Jerry. It was an early summer evening and I was in the office shooting the breeze with the chief and Pete, just getting ready to punch in for my shift, when a woman appeared in the police station surprising us. I say appeared because afterwards, when the 3 of us discussed what had happened, we were all in agreement that none of us had seen or heard her enter the room. It was as if one moment she wasn't there and the next she was. She was young, maybe in her late teens or early 20s, slender and might have been pretty, but you wouldn't have known that from looking at her in her current condition. For one, she was soaking wet. I mean absolutely drenched head to toe. Her dripping hair was matted and tangled all around her face and her dress, which I noticed looked kind of old-fashioned and it was saturated. She was panting and completely out of breath, as if she had just run a mile, and her eyes were frantic and wide with fear. Another thing I noticed was she was very pale, unnaturally pale. Her skin looked bone white. I guess we were all pretty taken aback by her appearance. For a few seconds, the three of us, me, Pete, and the chief, just gaped at her in shock. "Please, you have to help me." The chief, who had been sitting at his desk working on a jigsaw puzzle, it had been a pretty slow night, found his voice. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" he asked a little awkwardly. "Somebody kidnapped me. I managed to get away. I think they were going to kill me." We all traded a sober look. Things like this didn't happen very often in our town. "Well, why don't you have a seat and tell us all about it, ma'am?" The chief asked her politely and gestured to an empty chair next to his desk. She sat down, trembling slightly as if she was cold. The chief told Pete to go get a blanket for her. There was a supply of them in the basement of the municipal building, where the police department was located, which also served as an emergency shelter in bad weather. And Pete went to fetch one. The chief asked the young woman if she would care for some coffee, gesturing to the pot sitting on a table across the room. No, thank you," she said distantly, looking past him into space, distracted or maybe in shock. "What's your name, miss?" the chief asked her. "Shirley," the young woman stammered. "Shirley Ann McDougal." The chief took a police report form out of his desk drawer and jotted that down. Pete came back into the office carrying a blanket which he offered to Shirley Ann McDougal. She thanked him and wrapped it gratefully around her shoulders, but continued to shiver through the interview, as if it was impossible for her to warm her body back up. "How old are you, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked her. 19. He wrote that down. "Where do you live?" "Right here in town." "And how long have you lived here?" "My whole life." At this, the chief frowned a little. He threw a questioning look at Pete, who shrugged, and then me. I shook my head. I could see what was bothering the chief. When you've been a cop in a small town for long enough, you get to know most of the people who live in your jurisdiction. I had been a cop for 10 years at that point. Pete, who was older than me, had been one for close to 20, and the chief, who was older than both of us, had been one for nearly 40. And yet none of us had ever seen this woman, who claimed to have lived here her whole life, or heard of her before this night. "What's your address, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked her. "I live with my parents in their apartment, above the hardware store they own, McDougal's Hardware on Main Street." That was when I knew there was something really off about this whole deal. There was no McDougal's Hardware on Main Street. In fact, I'd never heard of anybody named McDougal ever living in the area. The chief was looking at Shirley strangely, but he continued doing it, by the book, and didn't miss a beat. "Now, Miss McDougal." "You can call me Shirley," she interrupted softly, still staring off vacantly at nothing in particular. "Shirley, why don't you tell us exactly what happened tonight?" And so she told us, and her story only got stranger and stranger. "I was coming back home from the movies. Me and my friends had gone to see the new Martin and Lewis comedy at the Mayan." "Whoa," Pete interrupted her at that point, raising his hand. "I'm sorry, you say you went to the Mayan?" "Yeah, to see Martin and Lewis." "Martin and who?" "You know, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. We went to see their new film, Partners. It just opened up last week." Pete met eyes with me. The look on his face was a combination of confusion and bewilderment. He mouthed the words, "What the heck is going on?" to me. Shirley went on. "Anyway, I was walking back home to my parents and I stopped at Beckman's drugstore to get a chocolate malt first." Beckman's drugstore. That rang a bell somewhere in some distant corner of my memory. I dug for it, and after a moment it came back. And Beckman's had been a pharmacy here in town when I'd been a little kid. An independent, family-run drugstore complete with an old-time soda fountain like something you would have seen back in the 50s. It had been owned and operated by the Beckmans for 3 generations, until the last of them, old Clyde Beckman, had died back in the late 90s. His kids had sold the business off, and now there was a CVS where it had once stood. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. I was going into the store, but a man approached me outside. He was an older man, maybe in his late 40s, silver hair. He was dressed like a priest and had a crutch under one arm. He asked me if I could help him. He said that his wallet had fallen under the seat of his car and he wanted to know if I would help him get it out for him. He was very polite. He seemed harmless and I felt sorry for him because of his crutch. He led me over to his car. "What kind of car was it, Shirley?" The chief interrupted her. She thought about it for a few seconds. "I think it was a Buick, yeah, it was a dark Buick. Couple of years old, maybe a 1953 or a 54. A 1953 or 1954 Buick that, according to Shirley McDougal, was only a couple of years old. What the heck was this? Was this chick on something, or was she nuts or pulling some stupid prank? I searched her face, trying to detect a lie, but she seemed genuinely shaken up by whatever she had been through. "Did you see the license plate, Shirley?" the chief asked her. "I just caught a glimpse as we were going around it. I didn't see the numbers, but I noticed it was an out-of-state car. I think the license plate said Oklahoma." "Then what happened, Shirley?" The chief prodded her gently. I knelt down and was feeling beneath the driver's seat for his wallet, and then she paused and took a long shaky breath and then exhaled it sharply, as if mustering her courage to recall what had happened. Something hit me in the head. It hit me hard. It was him, the man dressed like a priest. He hit me from behind, I think with the crutch that he was carrying. He hit me again. I was stunned, dazed. I think that I might have even lost consciousness for a few moments. When I came to, he was dragging me around to the back of his car. I tried to fight him off, but he slapped me in the face and told me to shut up or he'd kill me. He called me up. She hesitated. I would rather not repeat what he said. He lifted the lid of his trunk and shoved me inside and then slammed it shut. I was screaming at the top of my lungs and pounding against the truck, but he had already gotten back in and started the car. And then he was driving. I was screaming and crying and praying and begging him not to hurt me. I told him that I wanted to see my parents again. He just kept driving. I don't know how long he drove, a long time, maybe an hour, but then something happened. He had an accident. I heard him shout an alarm and then the car swerved sharply. I could hear the tires shriek. We went off the road. The next thing I knew, the trunk was filling with cold water. We must have crashed into a lake or a pond. I was panicking, pounding, trying to force the trunk open, and then I remember it just went black for a while. The next thing I remember is splashing around at the surface of the water. I don't know how I managed to get out. I swam to the shore and climbed back onto the road and just started walking back into town. Her story finished and Shirley fell silent. She lowered her head, shuddering. None of us knew what to say. We stood there trying to make sense of what she had told us. I looked at Pete and then at the chief. The chief looked back at me, a disturbed expression on his face. "May I use the telephone?" Shirley asked, looking up. "I want to call my parents and tell them that I'm all right." "Of course, Shirley, just give us 1 minute. We want to run this guy's description out on the radio. Get an APB going so that we can catch this creep," the chief told her in a slightly patronizing manner as he stood up, gesturing for me and Pete to follow him. He led us out of the office and to shut the door. "What the heck is she talking about, Chief?" Pete asked him in a subtle voice. "The Mayan Theater went out of business when I was a kid, 30 years ago. There's a liquor store there now." Yeah, and McDougal's hardware's long gone too, the chief replied. Long before your time, either of you. Burned down back when I was a kid in 67. Maybe 68, I think. And the McDougals went up in flames with it. They died in their sleep. Pete and me took a moment to absorb that. So what the heck's her deal? Is she crazy or strung out or what? The chief shrugged. Who knows, maybe something really did happen to her tonight and the trauma caused a psychotic episode. Dissociative identity disorder, whatever they call it. He opened the office door and motioned us back in. Shirley McDougal, or whatever her real name was still sitting beside the chief's desk. She looked up as we re-entered. Can I call my parents now? She asked urgently as the chief sat back down. They must be worried sick about me. Shirley, the chief said, staring at her thoughtfully. Who's the current U.S. president? She blinked at him. What? Dwight Eisenhower. What's that have to do with anything? The chief looked at her for what seemed like a long time. Shirley, he asked her softly, do you know what year it is? She gave him a puzzled look. Excuse me? Do you know what year it is? 1956, why do you ask? No, Shirley, he said gently, looking at her with compassion. It's not 1956. It's 2019. 1956 was 63 years ago. She looked at him, confused. 2019, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? Look at the calendar behind me, Shirley, he told her, pointing at the bulletin board on the wall above him. Looking at him suspiciously, Shirley stood and approached the calendar. She stood directly in front of it, staring for some time, and then she backed away, her eyes widening in disbelief. No, this is some sort of trick, it has to be, she stammered, terrified and confused. Shirley, the chief said, pointing at the computer on his desk. Have you ever seen one of these before? But Shirley ignored him. Her attention had shifted to a large map of the United States on the opposite wall. She stepped up to it, studying it intently. Hawaii and Alaska, she muttered quietly to herself. She moved to the window and looked outside at the parking lot. The cars, she said, her voice rising in panic. What's wrong with the cars? Why do they look so different? We stood by the chief's desk, just watching her, dumbfounded and not knowing how to react. Shirley turned to face us, beginning to shudder. She fell to her knees, clutching her midsection, her breath heaving in and out like she was hyperventilating. I think I'm gonna be sick, she uttered in a low and choked voice. Please, show me where the ladies' room is. I'm gonna be sick. Pete looked to the chief, who nodded, grim-faced. Pete helped Shirley to her feet and escorted her out of the office. He looked back at us and the chief and mouthed at him, Keep an eye on her. Pete nodded and then they stepped through the door and out of sight. A long, awkward moment of silence passed with the chief sitting at his desk, distractedly toying with a piece of his jigsaw puzzle, and me standing there, both of us trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. The entire encounter, from the moment the soaking wet young woman had entered the police station to when Pete had taken her to use the restroom, had lasted no more than 20 minutes. I finally broke the silence, forcing out a nervous laugh to try to lighten the mood. Weird night, huh? I said to the chief. He just grunted in response, seeming preoccupied with something. So who should we call, the state cops or the hospital? I asked. He didn't answer me. He was still lost in thought, staring intently straight ahead. What's on your mind, Chief? Something that just dawned on me a couple of minutes ago, just when Pete and her were leaving. He looked at me troubled. 1956 was 2 years before I was born, but McDougal's hardware store was still in town until I was 9. My parents used to do business with the McDougals. I remember something from when I was a kid, overhearing my parents talking. Something about the McDougals having a daughter that had vanished under mysterious circumstances. I looked at him. Oh, come on, Chief, you're not telling me you're actually buying into this thing, are you? That wouldn't be the first time something strange has happened in this town, he said, giving me a pointed look. I think you know what I'm talking about. I didn't answer him, but I did know what he was talking about. In my mind, I saw images that I cared not to remember. A blood-splattered motel room, sheets torn from the bed, bloody claw marks on a carpet trailing off and stopping abruptly at an empty closet. I shuddered at the memory. Suddenly, there was a commotion from down the hall. Pete was yelling for both of us to come quick. "Oh, what now?" I muttered as we hurried out of the office. Pete was standing in the hall just outside the women's restroom. He looked rattled. "She's gone," he said as we got closer. "What do you mean she's gone?" the chief demanded. "See for yourself." Pete answered and pushed open the restroom door. We looked in. All three stalls were standing with their doors open, vacant. The chief turned to Pete. "Wow, where the heck did she go? I thought you were watching her." "Chief, I was standing right outside her the whole time, I swear it." Pete insisted, looking anxious and scared. He muttered something to himself, something that I couldn't quite make out. I asked him to repeat it and he looked at me. I had never seen Pete look so frightened before in my life. I said she was cold. When I was helping her up to go to the restroom, my hand touched her arm. It was so cold, like touching the skin of a corpse. The chief shot me a grim look which I reciprocated, feeling a stirring of fear in the pit of my stomach. This was too much like what had happened back in 14. The chief and I entered the woman's room and looked around. There wasn't much to see and no obvious place to hide. 3 empty stalls and a sink. There was a small window directly above the sink. I approached it, certain that I was going to find it locked, but the latch was unfastened. I felt a weird sense of relief at that this avenue of denial, this fallback position of logical explanation, hadn't been blocked. Because otherwise... "Chief," I said, "window's unlocked. Outside, quick," he ordered me. Me and Pete hastily followed him down the hallway to the main entrance of the municipal building. The police department was on the ground level, and that's important. We went outside and looked around. All we saw was the front lawn of the municipal building and Main Street beyond it, mostly deserted on this early summer evening. The window in the women's restroom faced the left side of the building. We went in that direction, but when we turned the corner, there was nothing there. No sign of the mysterious young woman who called herself Shirley McDougal. I looked up. The window was about 10 feet above the ground, and while small, it was not impossible for somebody with a smaller build like Shirley to have squeezed right through it. What I'm getting at is, it was conceivable for her to have escaped out the window, dropped to the ground below, and then disappeared into the night. The grass had been recently mowed, and it hadn't been raining, so the ground hadn't left any footprints that we could see to determine which direction she had gone. We looked at that window for some time. Finally, the chief lowered his head and emitted a slightly shaky chuckle. She must have closed it behind her before she jumped. "Guess she was nuts, huh, Chief?" Pete said. "Guess so, or lying or on drugs, or who the heck knows." But that troubled, disturbed look was still in the chief's eyes, and I think he was trying to rationalize what had just happened as much as I was. "Let's go back inside," he told me and Pete, and that's just what we did. It was easier for us to believe that we had just been dealing with some deeply disturbed young woman or a flake looking for attention, because otherwise we would have to accept that, we had been questioning a ghost that summer night. The chief did report the incident to the state police and they put out an alert for her, but nothing ever came of it, and we never saw or heard from Shirley Ann McDougal ever again. I did some research in my free time just out of curiosity, searching online and looking through old newspapers and town records. There really had been a young woman named Shirley Ann McDougal, the 19-year-old daughter of Wilbur and Harriet McDougal, the owners of McDougal Hardware, and she really did disappear one night back in early August in 1956, never to be seen or heard from again. But for all I knew, the crazy woman that we had dealt with had known about the case and incorporated the details into her delusion. There were no pictures, if you were wondering. I looked, but I couldn't find anything in the newspapers. I even tried locating any of Shirley's surviving relatives, but to no avail. It had been over 60 years, and presumably, all the family photographs had been destroyed in the fire that had killed her parents. I forced it all out of my mind. I was a police officer, and there were more pressing matters to deal with. Eventually, I forgot all about my strange encounter with Shirley McDougal. And then last night, I went into the station to start my usual shift. The chief beckoned me into his office, his face pale and grave. He didn't say anything, just pointed to the newspaper on his desk. I picked it up and I looked at the headline. Lake yields dark secret after 66 years. The temperature in the chief's office seemed to drop 10 degrees as I read the story. One town over, some guy on a boat had been trying out his new fish locating sonar and had inadvertently stumbled upon an old car at the bottom of the lake, about 20 feet down. He went to the police and they had hoisted the car to the surface. An old battered, rusted wreck that had once been a 1953 Buick. A set of skeletal remains belonging to a man had been found in the driver's seat. The old Buick had an Oklahoma plate, and when the authorities ran it through the system, they discovered the vehicle was a match for a car registered to a man that the FBI had been looking for back in the mid-1950s. A drifter and convicted criminal they suspected of being a serial killer, or a spree killer as they called them back then, who was believed to have abducted and murdered up to 10 young women in 6 different states. His last intended victim had managed to escape. She claimed a man dressed as a priest had tried to lure her into his car and then overpower her. This had happened in Iowa, one state away from Minnesota. After that, he had just vanished off the FBI's radar. When they conducted a more detailed inspection of the wrecked Buick, they made a further gruesome discovery. A second skeleton was found in the trunk, a skeleton belonging to a young woman. Once more, it's me, the small-town Minnesota cop with an unfortunate penchant for getting himself mixed up with the bizarre, possibly supernatural, and sometimes downright terrifying things that occasionally happen when he's not too busy handing out speeding tickets, breaking up bar fights, and once in a while throwing a drunk farmer in a jail cell for giving his wife a broken nose because the Vikings lost to the Giants during the big game. They say bad things come in threes, so I suppose I should have seen this coming. Yes, it happened once again to yours truly. But after this time, I'm giving serious thought to just calling it quits and ending my career in law enforcement, maybe getting a job as a park ranger or a fishing guide. This one was the worst one yet, worse than the Garrity disappearance back in 14. And my strange encounter with the mysterious young woman who called herself Shirley Ann McDougal back in 19. Worse than both of them combined, even. I'm pretty shaken up by this recent one. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm scared. Not so much by what happened, but by the implications of it. If there's any truth to this one, then, well. It happened last Friday night. I wasn't even on duty when it happened, it was my off night. Things have changed since the last time that we got together. The chief retired last fall after 40 years. Ostensibly, it was because of health issues, but I have my doubts. He still seemed pretty spry and healthy the last time that I saw him at the retirement party that we threw him at the station. He took his wife and he moved to Colorado to live out his golden years as God intended, with a fishing rod in one hand and a can of hams in the other, as he put it. He was grinning when he said it, but it seemed a little forced. and there seemed to be some other expression lurking beneath the grin and in his eyes, something dark and taunted. I think maybe the denouncement of the McDougal case was the last straw for him. They ID'd the skeleton they found in the trunk of that rusted old Buick through old dental records and DNA, after someone provided the state police with an anonymous tip to the young woman's identity. And yep, sure enough, it was Shirley. I don't think it was just her and poor old Mrs. Garrity that was getting to him either. I have to remind myself that the chief had been in the force a heck of a lot longer than me and Jerry and Pete and Vance, and God only knows what he encountered during that time. He probably has his own share of stories to tell if he was so inclined. Anyway, when the chief stepped down, Vance took his place due to seniority. He's a competent cop with enough experience to make a decent replacement, but it's just not quite the same, and I don't think I'll ever think of him as the chief. Vance's first order of business with the town council's approval was to expand the police force in order to keep up with the town's increasing population. He hired 3 new officers. He also persuaded or pressured the council to increase the police department's budget. And with the extra funds, we got some much-needed newer cruisers, gear, and even radios. The downside to all these improvements was that, with 3 extra warm bodies, there weren't as many hours to go around, so my work schedule had been cut back some. I can't really complain. I'm a single guy and I own my own place, and town living is cheap. Plus, I really did need a break. So last Friday night, I was driving down one of our many rural country roads on my way into town with no other objective than to buy a case of beer and get drunk watching TV. It was just past 8 p.m., a pleasant spring evening with a clear and starry sky. I had the radio on listening to an old Black Hawk song that I liked as a kid, the one about the guy whose friend moved in up in the mountains to paint the world. I glanced at the dashboard clock and saw that it was 8:08 p.m. I reached for a cigarette from the pack of Winstons on the passenger seat. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light that filled all the windows of my car. Bright white light that seemed to fill the entire world. It was like being at ground zero at the moment of a nuclear explosion. In the millisecond before the blast vaporizes your entire body. I shouted and slammed on the brakes, raising an arm to shield my face and squeezing my eyes shut. I thought for sure that I was about to die. The Black Hawk song playing on my radio cut off abruptly. I sat there for probably at least a minute, my heart racing, hearing nothing but silence. Finally, I cautiously opened my eyes and the light was gone. Everything was back to normal. Jesus, I muttered to myself. What the heck was that? Bewildered but relieved to be alive, I put my foot back on the gas pedal. But my car wouldn't move. The engine had stopped. I turned the key over and over again, but it wouldn't start. My car was dead. I got out and popped the hood and raised it to inspect the engine. My car was only 3 years old and I had just had it serviced the previous month. I couldn't figure out what the heck was wrong with it, but then again, I'm a police officer, not an auto mechanic. Frustrated, I pulled out my phone to call AAA, but my phone wouldn't turn on. Like my car, it was also dead, even though the battery was still more than halfway charged. Now I was really getting pissed off. I was still 3 miles from town, stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. This was turning into a pretty crappy evening. I stood there for a couple of minutes and was just about to resign myself to the fact that I was going to have to walk the rest of the way into town to call a tow truck, when fortune smiled. I saw a pair of headlights coming down the road, approaching from the direction of town. I waved down the driver, and as the car got closer, I realized it was one of the town's new police cruisers. It slowed down and I saw the driver was none other than my regular partner, Jerry. I didn't spare the time to consider what an unusual coincidence this was. I was just overjoyed that now I didn't have to go on foot to get my car towed. My relief was short-lived though. Before I could open my mouth to explain my troubles, I saw the look on Jerry's face. He looked deeply worried and more than a little scared. "Jesus Christ," he said when he saw me. "Where the heck have you been? We've been trying to get a hold of you for almost an hour." Bad luck, my car broke down and my phone died. I stopped abruptly as his words registered. "Wait, what do you mean almost an hour? My phone died like 10 minutes ago." "Vance has been ringing your phone since 8:15. I even tried calling you myself. I was heading your way to see what the heck had happened to you." I looked at him confused. "Jer, I've only been stuck here for 10 minutes at the most." "Well, maybe your phone conked out before your car did and you didn't notice." "No, it happened almost at the same time. It was the craziest thing." "Oh, what is the time anyway?" He glanced at his dashboard. 9:06. This threw me for a loop. "What? Jerry, that's not possible. I saw the time right before my car broke down. It was 8:08. There's no way that I've been standing here for the better part of an hour." I was so bewildered by now that I had almost entirely forgotten about that strange, blinding flash of light that had seemed to pre-stage my car breaking down. "Man, I don't know what to tell you," Jerry answered with a shrug. "All I know is we've been trying to get a hold of you for dang near an hour." "Why have you been trying to call me?" I asked him with slowly dawning trepidation. Jerry looked at me gravely. There was an all too familiar expression of fear in his face, one I recognized from that day nearly a decade before, when we had driven out to Mrs. Garrity's farmhouse. "Something's happened to the Barker family. They're missing. Looks like a home invasion or abduction type deal." "Crap," I muttered. The Barkers in question were John and Sophie, a couple who lived on the outskirts of town, coincidentally not terribly far from where old Mrs. Garrity had once lived, with their 3 children. John Barker worked at a tractor supply store in the next town. He continued, "The chief, meaning Vance, wants everyone available. It's an all-hands-on-deck situation." He looked away from me, gulping nervously. I could tell that he was holding something back. "What aren't you telling me, Jer?" I asked him warily. He sighed. His expression was almost apologetic. "Now you better brace yourself. It looks like another weird one." I groaned. "Get in. I'll fill you in on the way." On the drive to the Barker house, Jerry told me what had happened. Just after 8, the town dispatcher Monica, our old dispatcher Karen, died peacefully 2 years back. Received a relay call from 911. The Barker's youngest daughter, Chloe, 6, said that she was locked in her parents' room and that somebody was inside her house. When asked if she could describe the intruders, all she could say was that the gray men had taken her family and they were in the house looking for her. Before the 911 operator could ask her anything else, Chloe had begun to scream piercingly in panicked horror, and then the line had gone dead. Pete and Joe had been sent along with 2 of the new town cops, Brandon and Lars, a big blonde Swedish guy, as backup. They had arrived at the Barker residence no more than 5 minutes after the call had been made, but there was no sign of the Barkers. All 5 of them, John, Sophie, Chloe, Jessica, 9, and Max, 14, were gone. But what they did find there was disturbing. After clearing the house, they had called Vance. "What did they find?" I asked Jerry. "You'll see for yourself in just a couple minutes," he told me, gesturing out the windshield. I looked and saw that we were already almost at the Barker's house. The place was encircled with cop cars, blue and red lights, strobing. Jerry parked and we got out. The whole town police force was gathered along with some detectives from the city, plus a forensics team from the state police, taking pictures and collecting evidence. Jerry led me towards the house, but a burly state trooper blocked my way with a stern expression. "Close crime scene," he barked in an officious tone. I was confused for a second and then realized, because I technically wasn't on duty, that I wasn't in uniform. "It's cool," Jerry told him. "He's a cop." The trooper raised a suspicious eyebrow but finally stepped aside. We went up to the front porch. The door was standing wide open but was blocked with crisscrossing strips of yellow crime scene tape. It was dark inside and the power was off. "Check this out," Jerry said and took out a flashlight, switching it on and shining it on the front door. "Whoa," I said, surprised. "What in the world?" The doorknob was missing from the front door, leaving only an empty hole. Except I registered after a split second that it wasn't missing. It was melted. A trail of liquefied steel that had since cooled and rehardened led down from the doorknob hole to a puddle on the floor like candle wax. "It gets weirder," Jerry told me. "The electricity's out in the house, but it doesn't look like an outage. Seems like it was a power surge of some kind. All the light bulbs inside had bursted." Hearing heavy footsteps approach behind us, we turned and saw Vance ascending the porch steps. "Oh, thank God," he said upon seeing me. "Where the heck have you been? I was starting to worry that you vanished right along with the Barkers." I explained to him my car troubles and how Jerry had just happened along at the right time. "Afraid you can't go in there just yet," he told me when I finished. "Not until after the state boys are finished searching for clues." "What did Pete and Joe find in there?" I asked him. "Well, Jerry probably already told you the power's out, but that's not all. Looks like there was some kind of standoff in there. Some of the windows and doors were barricaded, and they found a pile of spent .30-30 shells and a rifle on the floor of the living room, probably John Barker's rifle, but no sign of who or what he was shooting at. Upstairs, the doorknob of John and Sophie's bedroom, where their little girl made the call, is melted, and just like that." He indicated the front door. The phone was off the hook and dangling on its cord. Pete says it was still swinging when he and Joe entered the room, like she had just dropped it. If they had just gotten there maybe a minute sooner. He shook his head sadly. Something about what he had just told me didn't seem right. "You said the phone was off the hook. You mean the girl called 911 on a landline?" "Yeah." "Why didn't they call for help on their smartphones?" "Everybody's got one these days. It wasn't like they were caught off guard. They had enough time to try barricading the house." Vance shrugged. "Who the heck knows? Nothing about this seems to make much sense." "Is that it?" I asked him. "Oh no, there's more. Come with me around back. I want you to see something." Vance led me around the house into the backyard. I began to detect a smell in the air, the smoky smell of burnt vegetation, a smell that I associated with burning leaves in autumn. There were more cops and forensics back here, most of them crowded around something about 30 yards in the rear of the house. "First, look at this," Vance told me, and pointed to a wooden doghouse behind the back porch. I looked and I halted in my tracks. Jesus. The doghouse was squared off with more crime scene tape. A large German shepherd was sprawled on the ground, half in and half out of the doghouse. It was dead, its mouth open, teeth bared, and a frozen snarl. Its eyes were wide open and staring blankly at nothing. There were no marks on its body, no blood, nothing immediately apparent to cause death. It was still warm when Pete and Joe found it, Vance told me. "What in the world happened here then?" I said, mostly to myself. "Oh, you think that's weird? You ain't seen nothing yet," Vance said grimly. He gestured with his head toward the crowd gathered at the edge of the backyard. I approached, and the closer that I got, the stronger that smoky burning leaf smell became. The officers were formed in a loose circle around the perimeter of something, taking pictures and recording videos with their phones. I reached them and saw what was holding their attention. I stood, staring dumbly in shock and incomprehension. Sawhorses had been set up, cordoning off a perfect circle of scorched, blackened earth about 50 feet in diameter. The grass had been charred to a fine black powder that was still faintly smoking. I rode with Vance back to the municipal building in town where the police station was located. By then the story had broken to the nearest news outlets and there was something of a media circus. If you could call 3 news vans and a corresponding number of reporters and cameramen a circus outside, along with a number of curious locals. We ignored their questions and entered the building. I changed into a spare uniform that I kept in my locker. The state police had already issued a statewide alert for the missing family. The detectives were going to conduct door-to-door interviews with the Barkers' closest neighbors. Vance wanted the town police force to patrol the back roads and be on the lookout for anything that could prove useful in the investigation. In other words, busy work, so we didn't feel like a bunch of dumb hicks standing around with our thumbs up our butts, while the real police did all the important work. I entered Vance's office and found him sitting at his desk, in the middle of a conversation with Pete and Joe, who stood on the other side. Vance was telling them how he had just gotten a call from the FBI. A couple suits from the St. Paul branch of the Bureau were on their way. At this, Pete smirked at Joe and began to whistle the X-Files theme, which annoyed Vance, who told him to knock it off. Vance reminded him that 5 people, including 3 children, were missing, and it wasn't the time for joking around. Abashed, Pete apologized. Anyway, Vance went on, I want you and Joe to cruise the roads north of town. Brandon and Lars are already covering the south roads. You, he pointed at me, are going to ride with Jerry and... Just then the radio unit on Monica's desk crackled to life. Lars's voice came through the speakers. Come in, dispatch. This is Unit 2. Come in, dispatch. This is Unit 2. Do you copy? Over. Monica spoke into the microphone. Copy, Unit 2. This is dispatch. Dispatch. Is the chief there? Over. Unit 2. This is a dispatch. Yes, he's right here at his desk. Over. Dispatch. I need to speak to the chief urgently. We have a situation out here on Route 9, 3 miles out of town. Over. At the word situation, we all tensed up a bit. Vance got up and quickly crossed over to Monica's desk. He leaned close to the microphone. Unit 2, this is Vance. What do you mean by situation? Over. Me and Brandon found one of them. Vance's face paled. I felt a skittering sensation in my guts. Unit 2, what do you mean by you found one of them? Clarify. Over. We found one of the Barkers, the boy Max. He's alive. Me and Brandon came on him wandering down the side of the road naked. He's in bad shape, in shock, I think. Jesus Christ, I heard Pete whisper. Lars went on. We're taking him back to the station right now. Be there in about 20 minutes. Over. Copy, Unit 2. Vance said with forced composure, looking stunned by this development. Bring him in through the rear door. There's kind of a crowd outside and we don't need any unwanted attention. Over and out. Roger, Chief. Over and out. 20 minutes later, Lars and Brandon guided 14-year-old Max Barker, naked except for a blanket wrapped around him, down the rear service corridor of the municipal building and into the chief's office. Vance had already radioed out the news on the police frequency. Lars wasn't kidding, the kid was a mess. He just shuffled along, moving almost automatically like a robot. His face was completely blank, mouth gaping dumbly open, eyes vacant, catatonic. They gently led him to sit down on the couch. Vance dismissed Joe, Lars, and Brandon, telling them to go outside to control the crowd, which was getting agitated. Apparently one of the news vans had picked up word that one of the Barkers had been found on their scanner. They closed the door behind them, leaving only me, Pete, Vance, and the boy himself. Vance dragged up a chair and sat facing Max. Max, he asked very softly. Max didn't respond. Max, can you hear me? You're in the police station. It's all right, son, you're safe now. No response. The boy didn't even seem to blink. What happened to you, Max? What happened to your family? Nothing. Max, please, you have to tell us what happened tonight. It's very important that we know so we can find the rest of your family. The sooner we know, the sooner that we can help them." There was a very low, inaudible mumble. It took a moment for me to realize that it had come from Max himself. "What was that, Max?" Vance asked, sounding encouraged. He leaned closer. "Please, Max, speak up." "You can't." A weak rasp. Max swallowed hard and tried again, straining, forcing his voice to work. "You can't help them. They're gone." He began to tremble. Tears ran down his cheeks. His tremble became a shudder, causing the blanket pulled around his shoulders to fall down a little, revealing something odd. A small, perfectly rectangular patch of raised, pink skin just below his left collarbone. It was about the size of a domino. It looked like a welt or a burn and appeared very fresh. Vance pointed at the mark on Max's shoulder. "How did you get that, Max?" "They did it to me." "Who?" Max's next words made my skin shudder. "The Sky People. That's how they keep track of us." He looked at Vance with an agonized, horrified expression, cheeks streaked with tears. "They took us, just like they did last time, but this time they didn't bring us back. They kept my family and they would have kept me too, but I tricked them. I played dead. They dumped me. They need to keep us alive until..." He didn't finish. His shuddering worsened. "Until what, Max?" Vance pressed him. Max was silent. And then suddenly he began to scream hysterically in a panic, making us all jump. He thrashed around wildly, his face suddenly crazed. "They're going to come back for me. Don't you understand? They thought that I was dead, but they'll find out that I tricked them and they'll come back for me. They'll come back. They'll come back." Vance turned to me, alarmed. "Call an ambulance now." I pulled out a phone, but before I could dial 911, the door to the office slammed open. Two tall, muscular men in matching black suits and black ties over starched white shirts stood in the doorway. They had identical crew cuts. Their faces were clean-shaven and totally expressionless. "Hey," Vance said, surprised and angry. "Who the heck are you?" "We're with the government," one of the men replied in a flat, calm voice. "We're taking over this investigation," the other said. "Now wait a minute," Vance protested. "I'm the town police chief here. I'm in the middle of interviewing a witness." "Mr. Barker will be coming with us." The first man overrode him. His voice a monotone, his face perfectly neutral. "This is my jurisdiction." "Our authority exceeds your jurisdiction," the second told Vance. Vance stood up to confront them, pointing his finger. "You can't just come in here and..." With shocking speed, the first black-suited man grabbed Vance by the front of his shirt and spun him around, pinning him face first to the wall. "Hey, get your hands off me." Vance struggled, but the man was stronger. He held him firmly while the second black-suited man crossed the office to where Max was sitting. He had stopped, freaking out by then, and was just whimpering quietly, seemingly in a daze. Me and Pete just stood speechless, watching this transpire with disbelief. I wanted to speak up, wanted to come to Vance's defense, but was intimidated into inaction. These guys didn't look like someone that you wanted to mess around with. The second man helped Max to his feet and with his arm draped over the boy's shoulder, led the boy unrestingly out of Vance's office. The first man released Vance and followed after his partner, leaving the room without a word, gently closing the door behind him. Vance smoothed out his shirt, pissed off and outraged at being manhandled. "I can't believe they did that. I'm gonna report them to their field office for attacking an officer." "What are we going to do now, Chief?" Pete asked him. "That kid was our only lead on whatever the heck's going on." "Heck if I know," Vance muttered, running his fingers through his hair, still flustered. "It's out of our hands now. The feds have taken over." Just then, somebody rapped on the office door. "Oh, great, what now?" Vance snapped in irritation and he opened the door. A young man and woman in business suits, very clean-cut and professional-looking, stood there, both of them holding badges. "Chief?" the man asked. "Yeah, who are you?" Vance inquired bluntly. "I'm Agent Daniel Smithfield and this is my partner, Agent Kira Delaney. We're from the FBI." "What? Wait a minute," Vance exclaimed, thunderstruck. "If you're FBI, who the heck were those other guys?" The two agents glanced at each other confused. "What other guys?" the female agent said. "Those two big guys in black suits. They were just here not 5 minutes ago. They took the Barker kid with them." The two agents looked at each other again and then back to Vance, perplexed and troubled. "We don't know who you're talking about," the male agent replied. "There are no other agencies involved in this case that we're aware of. We just arrived in your town less than half an hour ago." The three of us, me, Pete, and Vance, gaped speechlessly at the two FBI agents, utterly baffled. It's been 5 days. Still no leads on the case and no sign of the missing Barker family. And no idea who those goons in suits were who absconded with Max, or what they wanted with him, or where they could have taken him. One interesting fact came to light after they finished investigating the Barker house. Not only was the house's electrical system completely blown out, but also so was every portable battery-powered device within the house, including the family's mobile phones. That's why the 911 call was made on a landline phone. One of those old, non-electric rotary dial ones, which apparently wasn't affected by whatever it was that happened there last Friday night. I don't think anyone's going to find the Barkers. Not us, and not the state police. Not the city cops or the feds or anyone else. I think we're looking a little too close to home, and the Barkers are somewhere far, far away. I don't know what the Sky people wanted with them, but I have a bad feeling that their intentions are not good. Like I said at the beginning, this is probably going to be the last time I have to deal with one of these freaky cases. I'm seriously considered turning in my badge and moving as far away from Minnesota as possible. But I wonder if it makes any difference where I go or how far I travel. You see, what really frightens me about all of this isn't just what happened to the Barkers. It's what I found the morning after when I was shaving. I spotted something in the mirror, something on my left shoulder, a perfect rectangle of a slightly raised, irritated skin, about the size of a domino.